Hello and welcome to my talk about our paper concerning the forensicability of neural network inference pipelines. This paper is joint research with Tobias Kupek and Rainer Böhme. Let's talk about what our title even means. One would assume that machine learning inference is a deterministic process, which is true, at least to some extent. We verified that executing the same exact model on the same exact input multiple times on the same CPU gives you identical results. However, if we execute the model on different CPUs, we can get different results. We analyzed this phenomenon by building equivalence classes as follows. Consider these two CPUs. Performing inferences on a randomly chosen MNIST sample gives the same vector of 10 softmax outputs. We will assign this vector to equivalence class A. Now we add a third CPU and predict the same input with the same model. Unlike before, we now get a different output vector, which we will assign to the new equivalence class B. We continue doing this for all CPUs available. Because we cannot swap CPUs fast enough for efficient experiments, we use instances on compute clouds from both Google and Amazon. We use multiple models and datasets, testing a single, randomly chosen sample on each and observing similar results. These findings are significant because they tell us that, given a model output, we can identify the CPU that was used to calculate it. With this, we can turn the table on the intersection of forensics and machine learning, and instead of using a neural network for a forensic task, we can make the inference pipeline itself the subject of forensic analysis. This is the main takeaway. Now I will show you how we analyze this phenomenon. To organize our analysis, we construct a system model of the standard machine learning inference pipeline. When we want to perform classification, we want a predicted label for some given input by using a previously trained model. This usually happens via some framework, TensorFlow in our case, which handles all the complicated intermediate steps for us. These intermediate steps involve preparing the compute plan, performing the actual computation, and then optionally applying an argmax to the classification confidences to obtain the final label. Our findings from above suggest that the model and input are not the only factors influencing the result. Hardware, software, and properties of the input seem to all influence the result. In principle, the same factors influence the training process as well. We did not examine training in our paper, but included in our system model for completeness. I have already shown you that we can leverage the real-valued prediction outputs to forensically analyze the CPU used for computing the prediction. Another focus point of our paper is whether the differences used for this come from the preparation of the compute plan or from the actual computation itself. To answer this question, we generated an optimized compute plan using the machine learning framework. This compute plan can then be executed on different CPUs without any additional changes. We generated compute plans on our 3 local machines, ensuring that the generation process is deterministic. Then we executed all 3 compute plans on all 3 machines, with somewhat unexpected results. Executing the same compute plan on different CPUs gives identical results, even for CPUs from Intel and AMD. However, generating the compute plan on different CPUs leads to vastly different results, as shown in this table. For our MNIST model, the equivalence classes look like they do for our first experiments. For the other models, we see different results even for CPUs in the same equivalence class. We don't currently know the reason behind this, but I would like to point out that forcing the generation of the compute plan as we did causes the framework to apply more aggressive model simplification techniques than regular execution. Another interesting finding is the fact that differences in the prediction go hand in hand with differences in the compute plan. This means that the compute plans for MNIST for both Skylake CPUs are identical. This means forensic analysis based on generated compute plans is possible even without performing prediction, simply by using diff or an equivalent tool on the generated compute plan. We now know that we can identify CPU architectures through their prediction outputs, but have not yet looked into what causes the differences in their outputs. To find the reason for this, let's re-examine the first table I showed. We observe fewer equivalence classes for MNIST than for the other datasets. MNIST is our simplest dataset, and it also uses the simplest model. Based on the observation that simpler models result in fewer equivalence classes, we want to find the minimum model complexity required for observing any differences at all. We tested a number of model configurations ranging from a simple multi-layer perceptron, which is built only from fully connected layers, to multiple convolutional layers of varying kernel sizes. From these results, we gathered that using fully connected layers alone is insufficient to observe the phenomenon. Using a single convolutional layer is also insufficient. It requires 2 or more convolutional layers to yield more than one equivalence class of outputs. Another confounding phenomenon is the fact that using 3x3 convolutional kernels gives more equivalence classes than using 4x4 kernels. Getting the same number of equivalence classes with 4x4 kernels requires increasing the number of filters to 2. The final question we asked ourselves is whether we can amplify these differences to make them observable through only the final discretized label. To this end, we generate samples extremely close to the decision boundary, which we call boundary samples. Predicting these boundary samples on different CPUs causes some architectures to predict different labels than others. Our boundary samples have far-reaching implications for machine learning security. They show that it is possible to craft adversarial samples that are correctly classified on one machine but misclassified on another. We have since expanded on this aspect in a follow-up paper that will be presented at the Information Hiding and Multimedia Security workshop in late June. There we show that it is possible to efficiently generate samples in such a way that it is possible to identify every CPU of a set of candidates based on predicted labels alone. Let me briefly summarize our results. We have shown that performing inference on different CPUs produces different results, and that these differences can be used to identify the CPU the inference was made on. We have identified that, at least for the framework we used, most of these differences are introduced in the compute plan generation process as opposed to the actual computation. We have found that different results occur only when using a sufficient number of convolutions, at least for the framework we used. We are currently unsure whether other layer types can also influence this. We have shown that it is possible to leverage these differences and identify the used CPU with only the final prediction label. This observation also has implications for machine learning security, because with this knowledge we can craft adversarial samples that are misclassified only on some machines. As you can imagine, we only scratched the surface and many more open questions remain. We only studied CPUs at the moment, and it is unclear how this phenomenon surfaces when performing inference on GPU. We also don't know whether the CPU can be identified without exact knowledge of the input or model. The diffuse nature of these observed differences also makes experimental analysis difficult, and a more theoretical analysis of the information theoretic bounds or the underlying phenomenon would be extremely beneficial. We find this an unforeseen and fascinating phenomenon, and are resolved to get to the bottom of it. If you would like to examine this yourself, we have published our experiment code on GitHub. We also provide a brief documentation on how to get started with the code. If you run into any issues, have further questions, or would like to get in contact in general, don't hesitate to write me an email, or check out my entry on our university's webpage. I hope you enjoyed my talk, and thank you for watching.